we've been embarking on this journey over the last month, for those of you that have joined us for the first time, we started a series in the book of Esther. And we've been going through the story of Esther. And last week we saw the pinnacle where God delivers and saves all his people. And it's like this amazing miracle that happens. And a demonstration of God having Esther in the right place at the right time. And Esther finding the courage to step out and do what God has called her to do. And save her people and be the person that God uses. It's an incredible story. And this week we're going to wrap it up. But I think what Esther does is it reminds us and it tells us about the character and the nature of God. And what you think about God, what you think about God's character and who he is, often will determine the way that you see the world around you, and sometimes even your experience in your relationship with or without God. In March 2011, so just over 10 years ago, they did a poll in the United States. But it'd be interesting to know what Canadians would think, but we haven't done one yet. And this is what the research concluded. That the question was asked, is God in control of natural disasters? So 56% of Americans surveyed believe that God is actually in control of the earth. 38%, almost 40% of Americans or people believe that God employs natural events in nature to dispense judgment. So almost half the people in the United States think that if there's a natural disaster, it's because God's judging that group of people, wherever it happens. 30% believe that God punishes entire nations for the sins of a few. It's a third, almost. Nearly 60% of Christians agree that God can use natural disasters to send us messages. 44% Christians say that the increasing severity of recent natural disasters is evidence that we are in the end times. So the world is coming to an end. Almost half the people believe that, because if we look at nature around us. 61% from mostly racial and ethnic minorities believe that natural disasters are God's way of testing our faith. Now those are just some random statistics about what happens when there's a natural disaster. And this tells you a lot about these individuals and these people and how they see God, doesn't it? There's a God who's judging people and trying to wipe them out with natural disasters. As people who believe that God's trying to use natural disasters to communicate with people and warn them and tell them. The other people that believe that God's trying to tell people this is the end of the time. There's all kinds of different ways that we view these natural disasters through our filter, through our lens of how we view God. And so this morning I want to ask, what is a healthy way to view God? And I think we find that at the end of, or the wrap-up of the story of Esther. There's a couple of principles that tell us, or a couple of key characteristics that we see of God, that help us keep a proper perspective of God's character and God's nature. If you'd like to follow along, I'm going to read the Esther chapter 8. It's not the entire. You can read 9 and 10 when you get home if you want, because we're going to start a new series next week. But we're going to read kind of the conclusion, or the big part of the conclusion, of Esther chapter 8 of the story that we've been going through the last couple of weeks. I'm reading from verse 1 and following from the NIV if you want to follow along. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman. Remember, he was the bad guy. He was the guy that they impaled on a pole, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off a signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. And Mordecai was the uncle that had adopted Esther, and had reminded Esther that she needed to stand up and find the courage to help be part of the plan to deliver God's people. And so Esther gives Mordecai the credit, and he's elevated to this power that Haman had, and replaces Haman. Gone from going to be killed because of the decree of the king to now in command. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan, Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. So you remember, Haman had got this plan that on this particular day, all the Jews were going to be wiped out, that anybody could just go steal Jews' properties, kill the people, kill the families, kill the kids, everybody. And so this is, even though Haman's been dealt with, and Haman's been killed, and he's been punished, the decree and the edict is still out there. And so Esther once again finds the courage to come to the king's presence. He extends the gold scepter to her, which allows her to come to his presence. And this is what she says. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards it with favor and thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling dispatches that Haman, son of Hagmanite the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on a pole to set up. Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you. And seal it with the king's signet written, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So the king said, do whatever you want. You got a free ticket. So at once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 33rd day of the 3rd month, in the month of Sivan. They wrote out Mordecai's orders to the Jews, to the satraps, governors, and nobles of all the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush, the known world. Those orders were written in the script in each province in the language of each person, and also to the Jews who wrote their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them out to the mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and alienate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them, and their women and their children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. They appointed for the Jews to do this was in all the provinces of King Xerxes, was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was issued as a law to every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves of their enemies. The couriers, riders of the horses went out, spurred by the king's command, and the edict was issued even in the citadel of Susa. So not only was King Esther saved, and not only was Mordecai saved, but now the king gives the permission for the Jews to protect themselves and stand up for their rights, and to stand up for their families and take vengeance on their enemies. And all the Jews go, yay! God delivered us from our enemies. And this is the story. If you sell Purim and March in Israel, they still celebrate this to this day. You go to the synagogue, they read the entire story, and this is like everybody's yelling and screaming at this point because God is the deliverer. He is saving. This is the story of Esther. And this tells us something about God. It tells us a couple things about God. And I think the first thing that this demonstrates, it tells us is that God is in control. Now, I know this has come up in many of the themes, many of the series that we've done, many of the scripture verses, but it's a good reminder because as human beings, sometimes it's so easy to look at our lives and to see what's going on and wondering, like, God, are you really there? Are you really in control? And the point of the story of Esther is that God actually is in control. He had orchestrated everything from the beginning to the end. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He put Esther in the right spot at the right time to save his people and Mordecai. Despite them being exiled in a country that was foreign to them, taken away from their homeland, God still was in control, even though they might have been wondering, God, where are you? You took us out of our homeland. You destroyed our temple. You let the city gates of Jerusalem be destroyed. You let us be slaves and sold into captivity. We're in a foreign land. God, are you really in control? And then it gets even worse, and then there's this guy who doesn't like Jews because Mordecai won't bow and worship him, and so he gets his edict written off, and so now this edict is that all the Jews are going to be killed on this certain day. Like, God, where are you? Are you in control? Like, talk about big question. But he is. He's in control through the whole thing. Amy Knight, a single mother of Kayla Ryan and Alexis, attends Whitehorse, Texas First Assembly and had heard stories of divine healing, but she never personally experienced one or seen one. When her 11-year-old daughter Kayla started complaining about ongoing headaches and continued to grow in severity, Amy desperately needed those healing stories to become personal reality. So you might have heard some stories. If you go on YouTube, you can see all kinds of miraculous stories of God intervening into people's lives and miracles happening. But maybe you've never experienced one. This was her case. But her daughter's headaches grew intensely. In May, Amy took Kayla to the emergency room. They took x-rays and noted an abnormality. Amy says they recommended that I would see a neurologist. Neurologist fees are high, so due to their income level, this is in the United States, Kayla qualified for Medicare, but it took weeks for Amy to find a doctor who would accept the Medicare payment because it wasn't quite enough. 2 months later, Kayla finally saw a doctor in a nearby place called Tyler, who ordered a CAT scan and then an MRI. By this time, Kayla was spending most of her time in bed, unable to get up. Her headaches were almost unbearable. The doctor in Tyler noticed a large white blotch on the MRI, which was a tumor in Kayla's brain. He immediately sent the pair to see a specialist in Dallas. Another MRI confirmed that the tumor had grown significantly. The doctor took me aside and told me that if it continued to grow at this current rate, within 2 weeks, it would cover her entire brain, and Kayla would be brain dead. What would you do? There was another option. There was surgery, but there was a 95% chance that Kayla would not survive the surgery. So it was a difficult decision, as you can well imagine. If you're a parent, like, what do you do? 2 weeks to live, 95% chance that if you do surgery, your daughter's not going to live. Amy chose, to let Kayla have at least whatever good life she could have for the last 2 weeks, rather than take such a long chance at an operation. I told the doctor that I was going to leave it in God's hands, she said. Amy told Kayla everything. We're going to let the church pray for you tonight, she said. They would believe together that God would remove the tumor. During the service that night, Senior Pastor Michael Fleming said, Kayla, we sat on the front pew, we gathered around her, they started to pray, they could feel the presence of God. We prayed that the tumor would be removed and the reports would be changed. Now 2 days later, Kayla was back in Dallas for another MRI, and the doctor soon called for Amy. I think I was getting really bad news, she remembers. The doctors put the MRI in front of me, and I really didn't know what I was looking at. In fact, the doctor was also stunned because the picture was blank. Amy thought that maybe the tumor had wrapped around Kayla's entire brain, but actually it was that the tumor had totally vanished without a trace. And Kayla's headaches, they were gone. The doctor told the mom to the visit that he believed in some sort of higher being, but he didn't believe in God. But after he saw those results, he said if he didn't believe in God before, he would never now. I told him he's not just my God, he's everybody's God. Since the initial report, Kayla has undergone 2 further exams, both giving her a clean bill of health. Amy says, I wasn't letting God take care of things I was supposed to. My faith wasn't where it was supposed to be. Yet God still intervened, and God was still in control. And Kayla was saved. Now that doesn't happen all the time, does it? But it does sometimes. And it demonstrates that God is in control and God knows exactly what He's doing with our lives and my life. In Job chapter 37, verse 15, in the Old Testament, do you not know that God controls the clouds and makes His lightning flash? In Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 14, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says, I will put an iron yoke on the necks of those nations to make them serve Nebuchadnezzar's king of Babylon, and they will serve him. I will even give him control over all the wild animals. God is also in control of history. So when things in our lives are falling apart and the story isn't going the way that we want it to go, and we find ourselves in captivity or exile or poor health or financial strain or whatever it is, in conflict and family and life, and it's not going the way that it's supposed to, and we've got heartache and pain and struggle, the temptation is to forget that He's still in control. And the story of Esther and the conclusion of Esther is such a strong reminder to God's people, to you and to I, that He is in control. You can look at the world around us, you can look at our governments, you can look at Western civilization, you go, God, what is going on? You're like, everything's falling apart. This is not the way it's supposed to be. There's immorality everywhere. There's sin everywhere. And God is still. The other obvious characteristic of God that this story demonstrates is that God is a deliverer. He's a deliverer. Tim Keller, who's a famous Christian writer and theologian, says this. As a young Christian pastor and author, Tim Keller said, I found the Old Testament to be confusing. You ever do that when you read through the Old Testament? You're like, I don't get this, God. Like, why did you do this? Why did you tell your people to do this? There's some pretty difficult things in the Old Testament to get your head wrapped around. And so Tim was really wrestling with this. But while he was at a study center, someone asked the great Bible scholar a question about the seemingly disjointedness between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I will always remember this professor's answer. Dr. Moiter was his name, insisted that we were all one people of God. Then he asked us to imagine how the Israelites under Moses would have given their testimony to someone who asked for it. So the Israelites said God took Moses to lead them out of Egypt, out of slavery. So this would be their testimony, something like this. We were in a foreign land, in bondage, under the sentence of death. But our mediator, the one who stands between us and God, came to us with a promise of deliverance. We trusted the promises of God, took shelter under the blood of the Lamb, the doorpost, the Pesach, and He led us out of our slavery, out of the land of Egypt. Now we're on our way to the promised land. We're not there yet, of course, but we have the law to guide us, and through the blood sacrifice we also have God's presence in our midst. So He will stay with us until we get to our true country, our everlasting home.
Amen.
Now that's his interpretation of what if you had asked a Jewish person coming out of Egypt what they would have said. That's almost exactly what we would say in the New Testament that's happening with Jesus, who delivers us, maybe not out of a physical bondage, but out of spiritual separation and sin. This is the same God who delivered the Israelites from Egyptian slavery, Daniel from the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the furnace, Elijah and Elisha from the powerful enemies of the armies that were against them, Esther and the Jews from the vindictive plot of Haman, Nehemiah from the surrounding armies of Israel as he begins to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, multiple minor prophets from famine and persecution, although not all, Paul from the bite of a viper on the island of Malta in the storm of a century, Peter freed from the wall of prisons while singing praises. You kind of get the idea? That the entire Bible from the beginning to the end is a story of not God only being in control, but God constantly delivering His people. Many times from our own screw-ups. Because we abandon Him so quickly and we get off on our own tangents and we get off on our own things that we want to do and we kind of rebel against God and we do it on our own strength. And yet God still in our time of need has this amazing ability to be present to deliver us. And we're not at the promised land. We're not with Him physically yet, but someday we are all working towards that place where we will pass from this life to the next life. For those of us that have a relationship with God, for those of us that are called His people, that have received Jesus' sacrifice to be with Him for all of eternity. God is a deliverer. Genesis chapter 14 verse 20. And praise be to the God Most High who delivered your enemies into your hand. Psalm 18 verse 2. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. Psalm chapter 40 verse 17. For as for me, I am poor and I am needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. This is God. He is a God who is in control. He is a God who is a deliverer. And He is also a God of justice. Of justice. As you read through the story of Esther, I mean, it's pretty obvious that there's huge injustice going on here. Haman's got a chip on his shoulder. He's angry at Mordecai because Mordecai won't bow down and worship him. It sounds really ridiculous in our society. And to a certain, it is, but he chip on his shoulder, he got mad. And he wasn't just happy with just dealing with injustice with Mordecai. He was going to wipe out the entire people. This is a huge injustice. And God has this uncanny way of when there's huge injustice happening, where He sends people, stands up, for justice. There's a tale of the two kings. I love this, because I love the story of Camelot. There's been so many interpretations of the story of Camelot, so many movies done on King Arthur and the Round Table. There's been TV series that have done this as well too. And we don't know a lot, but we know the story of Camelot. So here's the tale of two kings I want to read you this morning. Two of the greatest love stories ever told. The one Camelot and the other Calvary. Two of the noblest kings ever to live. The one King Arthur and the one the King of the Jews. There's one adorned with the jeweled crown, the other with a crown of thorns. The comparisons and the contrasts between Camelot and Calvary are many, but one scene from Camelot illustrates a great theological dilemma for all of us, that the cross resolves. Prior to his appointment with destiny to a blow of that faithful hail, Jesus agonized in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." At an emotional level here, this is the pleading of a son to his father. If your child was to go through such agonies to be crucified on a cross, what would you do? Wouldn't you do everything within your power to grant the request? But the father this time didn't respond as expected. He denied the request of his son, his only son, his beloved son. In Gethsemane, the son was asking, is there no other way? No other way. The son is betrayed, deserted, denied, beaten, tried, mocked, and finally crucified. Tacitly, the father answers, no, there's no other way. We find the answer to the question in the scene from Camelot, where the adulterous relationship between Queen Guinevere and Arthur's most trusted knight, Sir Lancelot, has divided the Round Table. Do you remember that part of the story? When the scheming Mordred, catches them in the clandestine encounter, Lancelot escapes. Guinevere is not so fortunate. She faces a trial. The jury finds her guilty and sentences her to the flame. As the day of execution nears, people from miles around with one question have one question in their minds. Will King Arthur let her die? Mordred gleefully captures the complexity of Arthur's predicament. Arthur, what a magnificent dilemma. Let her die and your life is over, because even though there was this unfaithfulness, even though this was their adultery, King Arthur still loved Guinevere, and to watch her die was going to break her heart. But let her live, and his life is a fraud. Which will it be, Arthur? Do you kill the queen or kill the law? Tragically but resolutely, Arthur decides treason has been committed. The jury has ruled. Let justice be done. High from the castle window stands Arthur as Guinevere enters the courtyard. She walks to her unlit stake, where the executioner stands with waiting torch. Arthur turns away, emotion brimming in his eyes. A herald mounts the tower where Arthur withdraws. The queen is at stake, your majesty. Shall I signal the torch? But the king cannot answer. Arthur's love for Jenny spills over with his broken heart. I can't let her die. Seeing Arthur crumble, Mordred relinquishes the moment and relishes the moment. Well, you're human after all, aren't you, Arthur? Human and helpless. Tragically, Arthur realizes the truth in Mordred's remark, but being only human, he is indeed helpless. But where the story ends, the greatest story ever told begins. Another execution time, another place, another king. The setting, the world lies estranged from God who loves it. Like Guinevere, an unfaithful, happy humanity stands guilty and in bondage, awaiting for judgment's torch. Could God turn his head away from the righteous demands of the law that simply excuse the world's sin? If not, he could turn his head from the world he loved. Could he turn from the world that he loved? Would the king burn Guinevere? Would God let the world burn? Like the wicked Mordred, Satan must have looked on in delight. God, what a magnificent dilemma. Let them die. Your life is over. Let them live. Your life's a fraud as God and King of the universe. Which will it be, God? Do you kill your world or do you kill the law? without even waiting for Guinevere to look up repentance, the king steps down into humanity's pocket-marked streets, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearances of man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. The king went to the cross and died for justice, to deliver you and me from our sin that separates us from him. God is not just a deliverer, but he is a deliverer of justice. He's in control. He's a deliverer. And he's a God of justice. And so when you look at the world around you and you see injustice, and you wonder where God is, God, are you in control? What about you being a deliverer? What about you being a God of justice? God is a God of justice, and as you see throughout the entire Old Testament and New Testament, he will bring about his justice. Ironically, in our society, which is running so far from God, this is the pillar of Western civilization. That there is a higher being above us. That there is a creator who loves us. And that he is a God of justice. And this is the foundation upon which many of our laws and many of our ethics and many of our moral principles were founded upon. That someday every single one of us will stand before this God and we will be held accountable for how we have lived our lives. Because he is a God of justice. And you remove that, and you end up with a society of anarchy, and destruction, and hatred, and vileness. And in that, God still strives to deliver and act in justice, with justice. So the question is, as we reflect, as we think about this, and as we understand what God's nature and his character is like, as we look at the story of Esther, we say, okay, God, you're in control. God, you're a deliverer. God, you're a God of justice. I get it. But what does that mean for me? How does that apply to my heart, my life, where I am at this time today? Here's just two thoughts. One, surrender. Because we like to be in control. We like to be the deliverer. We like to define justice sometimes the way that we think is the right way to act. But God says, leave it to me. You know, what happens when you come into a relationship with Jesus Christ is that actually what you are doing is you are surrendering your life. You're saying to God, okay, you know what? I get it. I get it. I was the Guinevere. I was that adulterous person. I was that person caught in sin. I am separated from you. Okay, I get it, God. I'm not in control of my life. I'm not the ultimate authority as much as I think I am. And so Jesus, what I'm going to do is I am going to surrender my life. I'm going to give it back to you. I'm going to become your son and daughter. I'm going to ask you to forgive my sins. I'm going to ask you to come into my life, into my heart. You're now my king. You now rule. And for the rest of my life, I'm going to seek your will, your justice, your deliverance from my life. I'm going to walk towards that promised land every single day of my life. I'm going to surrender to you. And boy, for most of us, that is so hard to do. Like, many of us come to faith and, okay, I get it. Okay, Jesus, I surrender. And we become a Christian, we invite Jesus Christ into our life, and then we stop. Or we go for a while and we attend church and we grow in our faith and we follow Jesus, and then something bad happens. Or something that we don't understand. or there's tension or turmoil or a leader or a church or whatever it is, something goes wrong and it just, they were a hypocrite, so it turns us off and we just we get angry or we get hurt or we get offended or we get upset, and then all of a sudden we go, well, yeah, okay, I'm kind of surrendered to you, God, but I'm going to do it kind of my own way and in my own place. And so our life of surrender kind of went up and then it crashed. And God wants every single part of us, and wants us to surrender our lives to Him. Because He's in control. He's a deliverer. He's a God of justice. That means surrendering our rights to enact vengeance upon others. When our enemies do say, talk behind our backs, we surrender it to God and say, you are the God of justice. You be my defense. Will you surrender? Secondly, will you trust? I can imagine, just a little bit, as we talked about last week, how terrified Esther would have been to go into the king's presence. To find that courage to stand up and say, you need to do something here. There's injustice going on, and God's been tapping on my heart and tapping on and I know I need to do this, but I'm not so sure I want to do this. And God, can't you use somebody else? And God, can't you do it another way? And for Mordecai, who was in sackcloth and ashes and at the gate mourning because all of his family is going to be wiped out. And he doesn't see the big picture. He doesn't know, how are you going to stop this? Like, Haman's still alive. He's doing this horrible thing. And how are you going to change such a massive edict all over the country, all over the known world? How are you going to save your people? And Mordecai has to trust God. Esther has to trust God. A lot of our stories don't end up with these stories like Kayla, where everything works out and it's a happy ending and we're healed from this miraculous thing. Or our kids all of a sudden change 180 degrees and turn from one direction to the other direction. Or the financial situation all of a sudden heals itself and all of a sudden we don't have a problem with money anymore. Or the family. Not all of our stories are happy endings, unfortunately. And it's in those valleys, it's in those struggles where we're asking God, where are you? What are you doing? How come? And what if? And where at? And how come? And can I? Where we surrender our will to God. And say, God, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know how this is working. And my heart's broken, and I'm upset, and I'm angry, and I'm offended, and you fill in the blank. But I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust in your justice and your deliverance. And as many of us know, that is so hard sometimes to do. But it's the essence of our faith. It's the essence of our belief in a God who's in control, who is our deliverer, and who is a God of justice. And at the end of the day, fights for us and loves us and lives with us in relationship because He's our King. If we will surrender and trust in Him. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for the amazing story that we have been able to walk through over the last month. And for just the amazing courage, the placement of the right people in the right place at the right time. The demonstration of your awesome character, that you are in control, God, that you are a deliverer, that you are a God of justice. Even when sometimes we really wonder, even when we doubt. Maybe you're listening online this morning, you're here, and you've never surrendered your life to Jesus in the first place. And the good news is is that when they're getting ready to burn you at the stake because of your sin, that the king has entered into this world and takes you down and becomes the punishment, takes death upon himself for you. Because he loves you. You need to surrender your life to Jesus and say, thank you. Forgive me. Enter into a relationship with him. Maybe you've been a Christian for a while. There's stuff going on. There's people that said this. There's situations that have been here. You're in wherever it is you find yourself in life. And the idea of surrendering to God is just so difficult. Because you don't know whether you can trust him. You don't really know if he's in control. You really wonder. It's okay to wonder. It's okay to doubt. But surrender it to him. And just watch what he does. And how he heals your heart. And takes your pain and your struggle, the darkness, and places it upon him. And you'll find relief and comfort in him. Father, we are so grateful, so thankful that we can trust you, surrender our lives to you, and trust in a God who is so good and in control, and a deliverer, and a God of justice. We give you praise, we give you worship in your name, Jesus.